Okay, our next topic is balanced and unbalanced forces. So we are going to see what are the balanced or study what are the balanced and the unbalanced forces. So coming on to balanced forces. So what is a balanced force? Okay, and to understand this, uh, let's take an example of a tug of war. So in a tug of war game, we apply a force. There are individuals on both the sides, and they are applying the force to get the rope on their side. So this is the force they are applying. Let's say this is the force F1 and this is the force F2. Now when the rope does not move, so that means both these forces are equal but in opposite direction. So both these forces are equal but they are in opposite direction and the rope is not moving, so that means their net result, not the net force on the rope is zero. So that is an example of the balanced force. So we can say that if resulted, so this is just an example of two forces. If there are number of forces, and if resultant, so in this case, in the a tug of war game, the resultant of these two forces is zero. So let's say we have a number of forces acting at a point on this object. So these are the number of forces acting on this object. Let's say F1, F2, F3, and F4, and this object does not move. So that means the resultant of all these forces, that is F1 plus F2 plus F3 plus F4 is zero. So all these forces, that the resultant of these forces is the balanced force. So we can say that if resultant total of all forces is, and these all forces are acting on an object, acting on an object is zero, then this force, we call it the balanced force. So this is a balanced force. An example of this is tug of war game. So we can say that a tug of war game, but in this case, when both teams they exert equal force. So that is an they exert equal force. That is an example of balanced force. And the next very good example of a balanced force is a stationary object. Now, how this stationary object is an example of the balanced force. Okay, let's say we have this stationary object, and let's say a box is kept on the ground. So this is a stationary object with a box that is kept on the ground. So this is the box that is kept on the ground. It is stationary. Now it does not move by itself and is stationary just because now the force of gravity is exerted from top to bottom. Let's say this is on the table. This is the force of gravity that is acting in the downward direction, and that is on the table. Let's say this is the table. Now, in turn, the table exerts equal and opposite force from, so this force of gravity is from, let's say, the top to bottom, and this may be a table or maybe a ground, and the force of reaction, this is the force of reaction the ground or the table exerts from bottom to top. And both the forces they balance each other. So these forces, the force of reaction and the force of gravity, they balance each other, due to which the object does not move or the box does not move. So this is an example of an balanced force. Now moving on to, before we move on to the unbalanced force, this balanced force, what could be the effect of the balanced force? Now the balanced force, its effect can be, it can change the shape and size. It can change the shape and size of an object. So we can say that whenever a balanced force and it is applied, it can change, ये change कर सकती है shape and size of an exam of an object. And a very good example of this is an inflated balloon. And if we apply force from this end and from this end, we can squeeze the balloon from both the sides and it changes the shape of the balloon. So the force that we have applied from both the ends is an example of the balanced force. And we can say now, in this case, we can say that balanced force can change the shape and size of an object. So balanced force can change the shape and size of an object. Moving on to the unbalanced force, the definition of this would be just the opposite of the definition of the balanced force. And in this case, the resultant total of all the forces is not zero. So when the resultant total of all forces is not zero, we say that it is an unbalanced force. So this is an example of an unbalanced, this is a definition of the unbalanced force. Now, what could be the example of the unbalanced force? The first one is the force required to move a stationary object. The force that is required to move stationary object is an example of an unbalanced force. Okay, so in this case, why it's an unbalanced force? Because we push it with the force, and that force should be more than the frictional force. Now, because the force now is unbalanced, that is the muscular force, and this is an example of an unbalanced force. Now, the another example of the unbalanced force could be the force required to stop moving object. This is an example of an unbalanced force. This is the force required to stop moving object. Okay, another example of the unbalanced force could be when we try to change the speed of a moving object. That is also an unbalanced force. Now we have studied the balanced and the unbalanced force, and the summary says for the balanced forces, the net force is zero. So this is zero net force, and when there is no net force, that means there is no acceleration. And for an unbalanced force, the net force, there is a net force, it's not zero. And because there is a net force, so that means this can cause acceleration. Okay, so this was about the balanced and the unbalanced forces. Let's move on to the next topic. Thank you for watching.